So welcome to all our viewers from around the world, wherever you're joining us from. It's now afternoon here in Bagot Street, and we say a Céad Míle Fáilte to you as you join us. We are very privileged to have with us Sister Brenda Dolphin, who's going to talk to us today about Catherine and her relationship with family. And the reason that we're running this program is that, as all of you know, this is the International Year of the Family, and it is of particular significance here in Dublin because in the next couple of weeks, Pope Francis will join families here in Ireland to celebrate the whole concept of family. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Sister Brenda Dolphin and to thank her for sharing with us her insights into Catherine, the woman who valued and treasured family in her life. Thank you. Thank you, Brenda.
So once again, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to each and all of you who are joining with us for this exploration of the influence of family life on Catherine McCauley. And as Mary said, like from August 22nd to the 26th, we have the privilege of celebrating with Catholics all over the world, with people of goodwill from all over the world, this third World Meeting of Families. So we will start our time together with the opening prayer, which is an official prayer for the World Meeting of Families. God our Father, we are brothers and sisters in Jesus, your Son, one family in the spirit of your love. Bless us with the joy of love. Make us patient and kind, gentle and generous, welcoming to those in need. Help us to live your forgiveness and peace. Protect all families in your loving care, especially those for whom we now pray. And we just take a minute to bring to mind the members of our own families and to say a word of thanks to God for the gift of family in our lives. The history of humankind, the history of salvation passes by way of the family. So this celebration, this World Meeting of Families, is a wonderful opportunity to celebrate family relationships, to reflect on how they so influence the individual person that the course of history can be affected by it. And again, I'd ask you, like, when you hear the word family, what does that say to you? Because the word family generally generates feelings of warmth, acceptance, and love. The joy of love, as Pope Francis says, is something we all experience in and associate with family. In our family, we learn to receive love, we learn to give love. We learn to understand more and more deeply what is meant by the saying, "You can count on me as I count on you." And if we're lucky, we also learn very gradually that love is not earned. Love is a gift to be treasured. Now, that's not to say that family life is all sweetness and light. You and I know it's not. We can get very angry with members of our family. We can hurt each other by what we say or by what we do. But we learn to struggle with our own shadow, with our desire to hurt in retaliation. We learn to say sorry. We learn to make up. So family can be the place where we learn to love ourselves as well as learning to love others, to love God. Families come in all shapes and sizes. and how we understand family can vary. But when we think about it, being a member of a family draws us into a whole network of relationships that continually shapes us, influencing the way we think and act and feel. Family is very influential in shaping our identity, enabling us to become who we are and who we're meant to be. It is a place we turn to for protection and for comfort when times are difficult. And relationships in family can change over time. At one stage, we are the ones being cared for, and at another, we are the ones doing the caring. A brother or sister who annoyed us and got on our nerves when we were adolescents becomes our best friend in our adult years. We all change and grow. And the good thing about family is, since we're in it for the long haul, we have a chance to see that growth, that development over time in ourselves and in others who live with us. I think most of all, when we lose a member of our family, we realize the treasure we have lost, and we experience a void that can never be filled. And I just ask you to think for a minute, like, to who are you closest in your family? And who is the person in your family who gets under your skin? And why? In order to reflect on relationships in the family in a concrete way rather than in the abstract, I'm taking as an example someone for whom family was extremely important, who was intensely involved with different members of her family in different ways, who had many difficulties with some members of her family, who knew the pain of losing beloved family members time and time again. Someone who did not experience some aspects of family life that can give us great joy, that can be life-enhancing, but who for all that grew to be a woman of great heart and of great love, and I'm talking about Catherine McCauley. So to start with, we look at Catherine and her parents, like the family influences in her childhood and adolescence. And let's explore Catherine's relationship as a daughter, her relationship with her father, with her mother, and with her adoptive parents, the Callahans. Her father, James McGauley, was Dublin born, and he was about 30 years older than her mother, Eleanor Conway, when they married in 1777. The couple had 3 children, 2 girls, Catherine and Mary, and a boy called James. When Catherine's father was alive, the family was comfortably off, and they were quite comfortable for a Catholic family in Ireland at the time, because James McGauley was an astute businessman. He was also known as an excellent carpenter, a wood carver. He was known as a merchant, a timber merchant with property holdings, who identified himself as a grazier when he leased land in Stormanston area of Dublin in 1770. He also had houses on Fishamble Street and in Copper Alley. Copper Alley is just off Lord Edward Street in the centre of Dublin, in the direct shadow of Dublin Castle. And while James McCauley was alive, that was no small feat for a Catholic in Dublin at the time. Catherine was only 5 years old when her father died. As the years passed, so we hear, her childhood memories of her father, though faint, are said to have clustered around his catechism classes and kindness to the poor children in the Stormanston and Fishamble neighbourhoods. We can imagine Catherine sitting close by her father as he spoke to these poor children who were gathered around him. And it would seem that she imbibed something of his great love for those less fortunate than himself, given her own choices in her later life. Like all children, she must also have picked up something of the tension between her parents in relation to these activities of her father, because her mother, Eleanor, was known to have often complained about her husband's generous gift of his time and resources. And maybe Catherine learned something here, that when we do good for others, we don't always get praise for it. For in later years, she would advise, God does not look at the action, but at the spirit motivating it. While her memories may have been vague, her father's influence seems to have penetrated into the deep recesses of her heart, because she too grew into a woman who had a deep and abiding respect and love for those less fortunate than she was. And that provided a beacon of inspiration that carried her through many of the ups and downs of life. And it was only in her adult years that Catherine came to know her father's business acumen, especially in the area of property. And also she learned about his long-remembered building and wood carving skills. St. Mary's Church was renovated when he was a young man, and he was the person who did wood carving in the church, and particularly the carving of the pulpit. She, in her turn, seems to have inherited his keen business sense, as we see in her many dealings in later life. And on reflection, this is something that happens often in families. It's often in our later years, when we're adults ourselves, that we come to really appreciate our parents and their gifts and talents, as we begin to see them as people in their own right and separate from the roles that they play in our lives. James Macaulay was a staunch Catholic, and whether some residue of his influence still affected Catherine's life in the area of religion, or else maybe it was the unspoken desire in her to keep something of his memory alive. Because as an adolescent, Catherine showed a steely determination in her refusal to change from her Catholic faith when the other members of her family changed theirs due to strong Protestant influences in their lives after James Macaulay's death. And as we see further on, religious beliefs and differences was a very big bone of contention in the Macaulay family. And it caused Catherine some of the major heartaches she experienced in relation to her family. At the same time, these difficulties seem to have also taught her to be wise, prudent, and courageous in her dealings with people who saw life from a different perspective to herself. An aspect of family life that must have impacted on Catherine as a young girl and as an adolescent was the constant moving from house to house during her later childhood and adolescent years. Even before James Macaulay died, the family had moved into Dublin, into the inner city in Dublin, to Fishamble Street from their home in Stormstown. And then in 1784, a year after her husband's death, Eleanor Conway Macaulay, now a widow, with 3 small children to rear on her own, who were between the ages of 5 and 4 months, moved her family to a house on the road to Glasnevin on the north side of the city. 3 years later, the family moved again, this time to 52 Queen Street. And they moved in to live with a very close friend of Eleanor's, who was a Protestant, and Mrs. St. George. When the family moved in with Mrs. St. George, Catherine was 9 years old at the time. She was probably tutored at home by her mother and possibly by Mrs. St. George. There's no records of Catherine attending a school for girls, although she was literate and cultured. She did what all young girls of her time did. She read books, and often she read books by candlelight. She learned to print. She would even print out the Psalter of Jesus. She began to write poetry, which she continued in later life and which she describes at this time as her pastime, her folly, and her play. She played with her sister and her brother. With her brother James, she sometimes got him into trouble when she did his homework and did it incorrectly. She had a good relationship with her sister Mary, but we do have an account of one time she did a little bit of snitching on Mary. She told her mother about some misdemeanor that Mary did, and Mary was punished for it by being left in a dark room with flames to warn her about the flames of hell, and she was left in that dark room for a length of time. These incidents with her brother and sister hurt Catherine, this we learned later on, because she would not willingly have caused pain to the people that she loved. For the 15 years between her father's death and the death of her mother, Catherine lived with her mother, her brother and sister in the inner city of Dublin. And as the years went by, their financial situation deteriorated. Eleanor was unable to manage the family finances and the business interests left to her by her husband. She herself was a fun-loving, sociable young woman who loved the high life of polite society in Dublin at the time. In fact, the manuscripts describe her as amiable, accomplished, highly cultivated, not interested in religion, as she believed in liberty of conscience, and found that any religious obligations that constrained a person were foreign to that spirit of freedom. However, on the other hand, as a mother, she seems to have been very strict in the way she brought up her children. She did have her children confirmed in the Catholic faith, and she insisted on the natural values of truthfulness and courtesy. As Catherine herself grew up, she was described as being an attractive blonde with a charming manner, but she also had a very determined manner or way of being. Catherine's relationship with her mother seems to have been good, but considering that Catherine had very definite ideas of her own and had qualities of leadership, we can expect that at times sparks would fly between them. What we can intuit from the mother and daughter relationship is that it was close. Eleanor's refined manners, her courtesy and style were some of the things that rubbed off, as it were, on her daughter. And Catherine would say in later years, as love begets love, so politeness begets politeness. They differed, however, as regards the practice of religion, and Catherine held on to her Catholic faith. But we do see that her mother did not force her to change her religion either. It would seem, deep down, however, that maybe the daughter had more depth to her character, more steeliness and determination than her mother had. She also had a better business sense, and this must have caused some differences between them, particularly as Catherine grew older and realized maybe how finances were going in the family. 2 years before Eleanor's death, in October 1798, the family were in very difficult circumstances money-wise, and they had to be broken up, with Mary and James moving in with the Armstrong family, who were relatives of their mother, while Catherine stayed with her mother. And they moved in with her mother's brother, Owen Conway, an army surgeon, and they lived with his family on East Arran Street. Catherine nursed her mother through a long illness, and we're told that Eleanor had a very difficult death. Seemingly, she was tormented and not serene, is what they say. We don't know exactly what the reason was, but we do know that this difficult death of Eleanor Conway had a very strong influence on Catherine herself. She was always very frightened of death until she came to her own deathbed, and by which time she had reached an extraordinary calm acceptance, which was a long way from the terror that gripped her in the face of death as a young 20-year-old woman. We can imagine how Catherine must have felt as she buried her mother. She was not only devastated by her loss, but now, and Catherine herself would have been the head of the family, she, her sister and brother were orphans without any money, dependent on the goodwill of family and friends, even for their bed and board. So I just ask you for a minute just to pause, try to imagine what that must have been like for a young woman on the cusp of adulthood in a society where women especially were very dependent on family means. Catherine was never homeless in the sense of being on the street. But she did, however, experience the pain and insecurity of the contracting of resources, of constant loss, the loss of her mother, the loss of her father, and also the constant uprooting of the family and the moving from house to house. Moving with the Callahans to Coolock, when she did that eventually, was the seventh move in Catherine's young life. The relocating from house to house, the precariousness of her family's financial situation was not lost on her. And it would seem that these situations became a means in time for deepening that unshakable trust in God, which she showed all through her adult life. She said, "In all this tripping about, we have one center, God, in whom we trust." And while she said that in relation to all the foundations that she made as a founder of a congregation, I think it was beginning in embryo, when also as a young woman she was moving from place to place and had to be uprooted so many times. She would also say, "We have ever confided largely in divine providence and shall continue to do so." There's also the fact that providing secure lodging for women and girls who had nowhere safe to live was also the first focus of her plan to help others when she inherited the Callahan fortune. And it's not hard for us to see why. If we look at Catherine and her relationship with the Callahans, the family influences, as it were, as she grew into early and middle adulthood. Just to say that before Catherine went to live with the Callahans, she spent 3 or 4 years with her sister and brother in the Armstrong household. This was after her mother's death. And this happened because her uncle, Owen Conway, with whom she had been staying since her mother fell ill, became bankrupt, and an extra mouth to feed became too much of a burden on the family. And it was Catherine herself who took the hard decision to move out and to move into the Armstrong household. And again, just pause and think of what anguish that must have caused the 20-year-old young woman, and what courage and selflessness it took to make that decision. And so a couple of years later, she accepted the invitation of the Callahans, who were friends of William Armstrong, to live with them as a companion to Catherine Callahan, firstly in their home in Mary Street, and then later that same year, she moved with them to Coolock House on the outskirts of the north side of Dublin, not very far from Storminston, where she had been born. William Callahan was a prominent apothecary in Dublin at the time. He was a Protestant, and his wife was a Quaker. They were a childless couple who had spent a number of years in India. Coolock offered Catherine Macaulay the security of a comfortable home. Added to this, the Callahans loved her from the very beginning. For them, she was the daughter they never had. But for herself, for a long time after she moved in, something she treasured was missing. It could not be found at the Callaghan's table, elegant as it was, or at their frequent parties, pleasant as they were. Once again, her unease came from the fact that she felt she could not express her Catholic faith openly in this situation. But despite this, Catherine grew deeply fond of her adoptive parents. She spent hours with Catherine Callaghan reading to her with a muted light because light hurt Catherine Callaghan's eyes. She nursed her constantly on her death in 1890. She was instrumental in enabling Catherine Callaghan to become a Catholic, which was a source of great joy to Catherine Macaulay, but also a source of great tension at the time that it happened, because she did not know how William Callaghan would take it and what his reaction might be and what the impact of her own life in Coolock might have as a result of her influence on Catherine Callaghan. After Catherine Callaghan's death, William Callaghan lived for another 3 years. And once again, Catherine devoted herself to his care, and again, she was devastated by his death as she had been by his wife Catherine's. It turned out that he was not outraged by his wife's conversion to Catholicism as Catherine had feared. In fact, towards the end of his life, he began to move in that direction himself, but he died before it actually came about. Before William Callaghan died, he protected Catherine's future and secured it for her, galvanized into action after overhearing relatives discuss what they would do to Catherine when they had control of his estate and of his house. The fact that he left her the sole residual legatee of his entire estate came as an enormous surprise to Catherine herself. It wasn't something that she had expected. She had to endure the contesting of the will by relatives of William Callaghan, but their challenge was to no avail. Catherine finally became his rightful and legally recognized heir in the years 1823 to 1824. Coolock again. Coolock House was a place of rich hospitality. The Callaghans entertained extensively, and Catherine presided at all these celebrations, and she learned a lot as she did so. Just very simply, we know from her letters in later life that she knew all the English ballroom dances, and she had a whole repertoire of songs and ballads that she put to good use later on when she lived in a religious community. And when she founded convents, she always tried to have a piano in the community room so that the sisters could entertain themselves at recreation times. And also, she liked to have the meat carved at dinner. She wasn't very interested in having someone serve at the table. Whatever happened in Catherine's heart during the years she spent with the Callaghans, 3 things can be identified. And the first of these was the graciousness and courtesy and hospitality that characterized her future life were fully developed during these years with the Callaghans in Coolock. And while these qualities were present in the young Catherine due to her mother's influence, as we've already noted, her life in the company of the Callaghans honed these qualities, which were the hallmark of her character throughout all her adult life. Secondly, during this time, she eventually sought guidance in relation to her own faith and the practice of it. And once she had plucked up the courage to do this, she found that the Callaghans, while preferring not to have religious symbols of the Catholic faith prominent in their home, were not hostile to Catherine practicing her faith openly. And in fact, they encouraged her to meet with the children of the estate, to teach them catechism, and to do whatever she could for them. Also, we note at this time that her own interior life of prayer and faith deepened. It was like as if this was like the hidden years of Jesus of Nazareth. These were the hidden years for Catherine Macaulay, her time in Coolock, when her interior life, her prayer life, her relationship with my poor abandoned Jesus, as she would say, grew, developed, strengthened, and really solidified. Her faith was also tested at this time as well. At the same time, there was also a reciprocal influencing between the two Catherines, Catherine Callahan and Catherine Macaulay, in the area of faith. If Catherine Callahan became a Catholic at the end of her life, Catherine Macaulay, for her part, was deeply influenced by the Quaker attitude to quiet, in prayer, and to reading scripture, something which was very unusual for a Catholic woman of the time, but something which was of great help to Catherine Macaulay in her later life. Catherine was always an ardent advocate of interweaving contemplation and action in any person's life, and she spoke about it many times, particularly to novices when she was founding a congregation. Another thing that happened while Catherine was in Coolock was she continued to develop and improve her nursing abilities, and always knew instinctively what was best for the sick person. So we can say, in the Callahan home and in the company of William and Catherine Callahan, she grew into mature womanhood, because it was during this time that her personality began to blossom and mature. And she was obviously loving, responsible, and sensible, since the elderly couple grew fonder of her as they entrusted more and more of the running of their home and of their estate to her. She was kind, considerate, and generous, not alone to the Callahans, not alone to their visitors, but also to the tenants and the workers on their estate, to their families and their children. Socially, she was like many another young woman of the Irish upper middle class of her time. But she was a young woman who was not only socially competent and able, but also someone who was developing an acute sense of social awareness. She was very sensitive to those less fortunate than herself. Also, her own experience of the loss of people she loved, of the difficulties around maintaining home and status, her experience of dependency on the goodwill of others affected her deeply. She would give material help whenever and wherever she could, often from the Callahan household with the blessing of William and Catherine, but also quite frequently too from her own pin money, which she could have used for other purposes, like, for example, buying a bonnet or doing something like that. In her giving, we learn that she always tried to turn the person's attention to God, the giver of all good, rather than focusing on herself. So we see how influential the Callahans were in Catherine's life. Their legacy to her was not simply a monetary material one, it went far, far deeper than that. Now let's turn and have a look at Catherine and her brother and sister. The interaction, the influences of siblings in a family. That Catherine was very close to her sister Mary seems evident from the intimate trust that Mary placed in her when they were both adults, and especially at the end of Mary's life. Even though they lived in different families towards the end of their adolescence and towards the end of their mother's life, and even though Mary was to move away from her Catholic religion and embrace the Protestant religion of the Armstrong family with whom she lived, this did not not seen to distance the sisters one from another. Some differences in personality between the sisters include the fact that Mary, as a young woman, was very interested in style and parties, while Catherine, although she would go along with Mary, especially when they lived in the Armstrong household, and she was quite interested in fashion herself. In fact, when they were looking at Catherine's life for her cause, some theologians said that she was a little frivolous. She was too interested in fashion. But in reality, Mary, she was part of, the social life of her own time. But while she'd go along with Mary, she was really less interested in that aspect of life. She did have a number of offers of marriage, both as a young girl and later when she became an heiress. But always, from day one, Catherine showed no interest in getting married. She had a different dream for her life. In 1804, when she was about 24 years of age, Mary Macaulay married William Armstrong Macaulay. He was an apothecary and later became a surgeon. And the couple had 5 children who lived. They lost a number of children as well. Catherine was a frequent visitor to the Macaulay home, and the children grew very fond of their aunt. In 1819, William was appointed assistant surgeon in the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham, where he served aged and wounded veterans. He was also a distinguished member of the Apothecaries' Hall, and his relationship with William Armstrong was built up because both of them were part of that group. When Catherine was building the house on Bagot Street, she didn't tell family members what she really intended. Mary got the same reply as others did, that the house was for the poor in a generic sense. In contrast to their brother James, Mary expressed her delight at this prospect and was looking forward to seeing the poor enjoy the comfort of the big house. But she didn't live to see it finished. In 1827, which was a very busy year for Catherine, but in 1827, Mary was about 47 years old at the time, and she had been ill with tuberculosis for a while already, and she became increasingly sick. So at that time, Catherine made the Macaulay home on Military Road her principal residence, making regular trips to Coolock House, and after September 24th, daily trips to the house here on Bagot Street. Mary died in August 1827, leaving 5 children between the ages of 16 and 5. And they were Mary, James, Robert, Catherine, and William. And Catherine stayed on at the Macaulay home for a number of months after Mary's death because Mary Macaulay, the eldest of the Macaulay children, was too young to undertake the running of her father's home at that time. As well as this, the Macaulay family had a house in the suburbs of Dublin in Dundrum, and Mary asked to spend her last months in this house because the fresh air on the outskirts of the city would be good for her illness. It was there that she was received back into the Catholic Church, and this unknown to her husband. Sometime later, he got very irate with Catherine when he found out that she was instrumental in enabling Mary's return to her Catholic faith on her deathbed. He was so angry when he heard the news that Catherine had to flee the house in her dressing gown for a couple of hours in the interests of her own safety and go to a Dr. Cusick's lodgings in the Royal Hospital. However, it didn't last too long. The next morning, William Macaulay was extremely contrite for his outburst, and they cooled down, and she and her brother-in-law were reconciled, and she went back to the house on Military Road. Just a year after his wife's death, William Macaulay, after a very short illness, actually he was ill just 3 days, with an ulcerated sore throat and high fever, and he died in February of 1829. The eldest of his children was 18 at the time, the youngest was 7. An interesting thing, given the incident between William and Catherine on account of Mary returning to the Catholic faith before her death, in his will, William Macaulay, much to the surprise of everyone, left it up to his children to choose who their guardian would be, either their Aunt Catherine or her brother James, their Uncle James. Catherine, of course, we know is a Catholic. James was a very staunch Protestant, like William Macaulay himself. Now, what happened was all the Macaulay children chose Catherine, much to their Uncle James' astonishment and indignation. And the large Derry manuscript tells us he gave expression to that indignation in no unmeasured terms. So Catherine was good at bringing on the wrath of the men in her family. The daughters, that is, Mary Macaulay and Catherine Macaulay, continued to reside in Baggot Street with their aunt Catherine, who was now living there full-time in 1829. And the brothers, that is, Robert, James, and William, were sent to a boarding school in Carlow. The depth of the relationship between Catherine and her sister can be seen from what I've just said. Obviously, Catherine was a frequent visitor to the Macaulay home from the time of Mary's marriage, and the closest person the children knew to a mother when their own beloved mother had died, and they were extremely fond of their own mother. Mary's eldest daughter, also called Mary, was particularly attached to her aunt. And it's also interesting that Catherine actually would jeopardize her relationship with her brother-in-law, and as a consequence could have jeopardized her relationship with her beloved nieces and nephews in order to enable Mary to come back to a Catholic faith, which shows us that Catherine put what she saw as Mary's best interest before her own. And in this situation, with Mary's return to the faith, was a replication of what happened for Catherine with Catherine Callahan, but without the same dramatic consequences. And we see in this how fraught relationships can become in a family, especially where strongly held beliefs and relationships, beliefs and values can clash. And again, it's a tribute to Catherine and to William Macaulay that they were able to resolve their differences. This is one of the things we see in Catherine's family, that no matter how deep their differences went, there was no severing of real ties in the family. And that was due in no small measure to Catherine herself and her desire to maintain those relationships, but also, it also reflects very well on other people like William Macaulay and James Macaulay. So William and Catherine were able to resolve their differences, especially for the sake of the children who at that time were deeply affected by the loss of their mother. And obviously, William Macaulay didn't hold it against his sister-in-law, as was seen in what he said in his will in relation to the guardianship of his children. If we turn to the relationship between Catherine and her brother James, it was much more formal and distant. James was born in 1783, was therefore 5 years younger than Catherine. And he was one person who referred to Catherine as Kitty. When the construction of the House of Mercy on Baggot Street was underway, James is said to have called the building Kitty's Folly. And that's a name that has survived the centuries and even become an affectionate nickname for this building. James was not quite 4 months old when his father died in July of the year of his birth. He went to live with William Armstrong as family finances began to fail even before his mother's death. Quickly, he adopted the religion of the family he was living with, and as he grew into adulthood, became a rigid and a staunch Protestant. He was enrolled in the Royal Hibernian Military School in the late 1790s, 1800s. He was certified as an apprentice to an apothecary in 1802, admitted as a member of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1810, having been presented for certification as assistant surgeon by the Royal Army Medical Corps. And after service in the wars between England and France, having participated in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, he came back to Dublin. He was appointed assistant surgeon in the Royal Hibernian Military School in the Phoenix Park. Then he earned a degree as a medical doctor from Edinburgh. And then he moved to the Royal Hibernian Military School, and from there to the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham in 1829. And I speak of all of these just to give you an idea of the kind of education and the kind of influences on James's life that maybe helps us to understand the kind of person he was. He married Frances Ridgway in 1821. They had 10 children. And James, Frances, and 2 of their daughters were present at Catherine's bedside on the day she died, November the 11th, 1841. And Frances, her sister-in-law, was there at the actual death of Catherine. We have some inkling of distance between the brother and sisters, seen in the fact that Catherine didn't confide to James anything about her plans for the use of her inheritance in the building of the house in Bagot Street. And that would be unusual, because usually it was the males in a family who would deal with things like construction, etc. She knew he wouldn't have encouraged it, and he might have tried to prevent it. Again, she had to use all her tact to maintain the relationship alive, especially after Mary and William Macaulay's deaths and the choice of guardian made by their children. It was James who insisted that young Catherine Macaulay leave Bagot Street when she made it known she wanted to join the community there when she was only 15 years of age. What happened was that after her sister Mary died, young Catherine Macaulay left Bagot Street for a number of months at the insistence of her Uncle James. She'd obviously declared her intention to be a member of the Bagot Street community as Mary had been, but James considered her too young for that, and obviously Catherine Macaulay Sr. concurred. James brought the young Catherine to his own home, where she had the possibility of entering into the life of high society at the time. However, again, as the manuscripts tell us, neither the persuasions of her uncle nor the fascination of the society to which he took care to introduce her could make her change her mind. Eventually, her uncle left her at liberty to follow her own wishes, and immediately she returned to Bagot Street and became a Sister of Mercy. This incident goes to show us that Catherine did not cut her nieces and nephews off from relationships with their uncle and his family. And in the case of the young Catherine Sr. obviously concurred with her brother that some time away from Bagot Street would be good for the young girl before she made her final decision. So no matter what the differences of values, outlook, the family tie, as I've said, was never severed. And as we notice, Catherine loved her Macaulay nieces as well as the other family, Mary's children, because we have in a letter her asking her brother to kiss Emily and Ellen with a sweet kiss from her. So, you know, we've little information about that side of the family, but we know that Catherine was deeply fond of them. Just a few words on Catherine as helicopter auntie, as it were, as adoptive mother, her relationships with her nieces, nephews, and the children she adopted. In 1829, on the death of William Macaulay, as we've seen, Catherine became the adoptive mother of now 9 children. The 5 Macaulay children had all chosen Catherine as their legal guardian, and she had already adopted Teresa Byrne and Catherine Byrne, who were Anne Conway Byrne's children. She was adoptive mother also to at least 2 other children at the time, Ellen Corrigan and Anne Rice. And again, the manuscripts say to us that Anne Rice was probably the little orphan that Catherine Macaulay adopted after she had found her on the street outside the cellar which her then dead parents had occupied. And again, the manuscripts say that she, Anne Rice, was also the reason why Catherine added the care of orphans to the works of the institute. In 1829, after their father's sudden death, when she became their guardian, Catherine Macaulay registered her 3 nephews, James, Robert, and William, in a lay boarding school in Carlow. In November of the same year, 1829, Mary Macaulay, Catherine's eldest niece, who was 18 years old at the time, had been baptized a Catholic, decided she wanted to join the community in Baggot Street and be part of the group of volunteer ladies who worked in the House of Mercy. Mary had always been very attached to Catherine, even before her mother's death, and she wanted to become a Catholic like her Aunt Catherine. Also, Mary Macaulay, that's Catherine's sister, had communicated to her daughter that she had returned to her faith, and she did this before she died, even though she didn't tell her husband. While Catherine Macaulay was still living in the Macaulay home in Military Road after her sister's death, she would go daily to visit this house in Baggot Street, and her eldest niece always accompanied her. So if Mary was attached to Catherine, Catherine was also attached to Mary. When the congregation was founded in 1831, the first 10 members of the congregation to be received among them in 1832 were Catherine Byrne, that's Anne Conway's daughter, and Mary Macaulay. Catherine Byrne, however, decided to leave the community in December of the same year, and she joined the Dominican Sisters in Cabra. The way Catherine Byrne went about making this choice hurt Catherine very much, because Catherine Byrne made all her arrangements secretly, and that hurt Catherine Macaulay. Catherine said very little about how she felt about Catherine's, what she did, but she did make it clear she would never stand in Catherine Byrne's way as she made her choice to transfer to another congregation. And then, that year, Mary Macaulay contracted the dreaded disease TB. She fell seriously ill, made her profession in a private ceremony on November the 3rd, 1833. She died just after midnight on November the 12th. And we can only imagine Catherine Macaulay's heartbreak at seeing her beloved niece follow the same road as her mother, but so much earlier in life. And the next year, Catherine's younger sister, Catherine Macaulay, entered the congregation. She received the habit later in July of the same year. She made her vows in 1836, and she too died of TB in 1837. And once again, Catherine Macaulay was devastated by the loss of a beloved family member to that dreaded disease. She says in a letter to the president of Carlow College, where Catherine Macaulay, young Catherine Macaulay's brothers were still at school, she says, "Our innocent little Catherine died before midnight last night. We just feel now as if all the house was dead. All are sorry to part with our animated, sweet little companion." It just shows us what Catherine must have felt at the loss of both her nieces. And you know, can you imagine what it must have been like? Because also the same month that Catherine Macaulay Jr. died, Teresa Byrne entered the community in Baggot Street. So can you imagine what it must have been like for Catherine? First, the joy at seeing so many of her adopted children join her charitable work and later as religious, and then the heartbreak and the devastation at losing so many loved ones so much younger than herself in a few short years. That constant intertwining of, you know, light and shade, of death and life, of, as it were, passion and resurrection, that constant intermingling of pain and joy in her life was something Catherine was very aware of all of her life. We know how much she was affected by the loss of sisters later on when she founded the congregation. Because firstly, she loses Mary Macaulay. Then Catherine Macaulay and Ellen Corrigan also died the very same year as young Catherine did, either from TB or typhoid. Catherine's own heartbreak can barely be imagined. She'd been there for her nieces and nephews all through their mother's protracted illness, to the sudden loss of their father, for Catherine and the Macaulay boys to the loss of their elder sister. Just in relation to her nephews, and I often think Catherine did better with her nieces than she actually did with her nephews. Catherine had great hopes for them because, again, as the manuscripts tell us, they were of amiable disposition and had fine talent. But as Mary Clare Moore said in her manuscript, being deprived of the restraint and guidance of a father's hand, they had neglected the opportunities for their advancement. There might have been more to it than just that, but at least that's what she said. TB was the cause of both Robert and James's deaths in quick succession. Robert died in 1840 and James in 1841, just predeceased Catherine herself. So Catherine was left standing at the edge of the open grave. Only Catherine Byrne and Teresa Byrne, and then Willie Macaulay, as we found out later, survived her. We do not know what happened to Anne Rice, but all her other adopted children predeceased her. William, young Willie as he was called, was the youngest. He was wild. Catherine was unhappy with him on account of some foolish behaviour on his part. He went to sea twice in 1830, firstly after his sister Catherine's death, and then again in December of the same year. He sent a letter to his aunt, but he didn't come to visit her between the sailings for obvious reasons. They hadn't got on so well. So Catherine was left with unfinished business in relation to William, and since he didn't come back to see her, she never saw him again, and she thought that he was lost at sea. She never knew that he had survived to reach Australia. She never knew that he lived to be 83 years of age. She never knew that he had established a family in Australia. She never knew that she had a niece, a daughter of Willie's, who entered Kyneton in the Sisters of Mercy in Kyneton in Australia. She never knew all of that. It was only a few years after Catherine's death that Willie made contact with the sisters here in Baggot Street through his cousin, Teresa Byrne. Like a mother in any family, for her children are concerned, there are the joys and the highs, then there are the lows, the disappointments, the unfinished business, the heartache. Catherine was no stranger to all these feelings in relation to the children she adopted and cared for. The loss of so many people that she loved and cared about, and especially those much younger than herself, was a very heavy cross for her. And she would say, the tomb never seems closed in my regard. And finally, a word on Catherine as niece and cousin. You remember we said already that Catherine's relationships with the Conway family. As her family fortunes began to decline and gradually evaporate, Catherine had already moved in with her mother to the home of her mother's brother, Owen Conway. After her mother's death, we saw Catherine continue to live in the Conway home. However, she was not there for very long when Owen Conway's fortunes began to slide. And while Catherine knew that she was loved and accepted and very welcome in his house, she also realized that her staying there meant an extra person to feed, which increased the family's burden. And so, as we saw already, she decided to move to the Armstrong home where her brother and sister already lived. But while Catherine lived in the Conways, she was inserted into a very Catholic atmosphere, and living with them allowed her to develop and to freely practice her faith. Her uncle was very fond of her, and Catherine would attribute the preservation of her faith to the time she spent in the Conway home, because she saw how her brother and sister lost their faith because they were surrounded by Protestants from a very early age. Catherine made the choice, and that's why I said it was a very difficult choice for her. She made the choice to go to the Armstrong family because she knew the Conways couldn't support her. She knew she'd be very welcome at the Armstrong family. She'd be very much loved there. but she also knew that practicing her Catholic faith would not be looked on kindly there, and that was the heartache for her. One of the great blessings of her time in the Conway family was also the chance she had to build a very close relationship with Anne Conway, that is the daughter of Owen, her first cousin. Catherine and Anne were best friends, and the friendship was so deep and so close that it extended well beyond the lifetime of Anne Conway, who married a James Byrne, who was a Dublin printer. Because Catherine adopted firstly the youngest child, Teresa, as a baby because her mother was ill when the child was born. And then when Anne Conway died, she adopted the eldest child, Catherine, who was 10 years old at the time. Both Teresa and Catherine joined the community in Baggot Street. And Catherine left after her first profession, as we know, to join the Dominicans in Cabra. Teresa continued with the sisters here. And Anne Conway's third daughter, also called Anne, she joined the Mercy congregation after her sisters and spent her life living and working in England. And often in a family, friendship between cousins can often be very close and very strong. Sometimes cousins are even closer than brothers and sisters might be. And certainly the relationship between Anne Conway and Catherine McCauley was very deep. Just a point before I conclude. Catherine didn't have the joy of knowing grandparents. You know, that's something that we have a great joy in knowing today. Great grandparents and sometimes great grandparents. Because this can be, you know, a great source of love, of joy, and it's one of the great gifts of family we have today. Catherine McCauley didn't experience that. She didn't experience physical motherhood. However, she did know something of the love, the joy, and the heartache of a mother for her children. And she would have run the whole gamut of pride and joy, of anxiety and pain that every loving mother knows in relation to her children. So in conclusion, Catherine had a great respect for family. This can be seen in her original vision for the work of Mercy. When building Baggot Street, she intended it to have some apartments for ladies who might choose for any definite or indefinite time to devote themselves to the service of the poor without the restriction of vow and remaining at liberty to visit their families and relatives or even to remain with them for a time in case of difficulty or illness. She knew how important family was to anybody. She also had another family she loved, and this was the group of women who joined first as volunteers, later as members of the congregation that she founded. And just one point, in the founding of the congregation, she was much older than any of the women who joined us. But also, all accounts would tell us that she never allowed the gap to interfere with any of her relationships with her co-workers and sisters. In fact, she was very young at heart and was most at home when she was playing tricks and entertaining the community or getting into mischief with novices. There was that sense of lightheartedness in Catherine McCauley. She did extraordinary ability as well to bring out the best in those with whom she lived and worked. So Catherine's family experiences, which affected the kind of person she became, were rich, were varied. The influences in her life diverse and formative, and her own inner ability and openness to learn and be formed and reformed, as she says herself, it's not surprising that she grew into the well-rounded, loving, and lovable person that those who knew her forever proclaimed. We thank God for Catherine McCauley. We thank God for her family. And we conclude with the last part of the official prayer for families that we say at the moment. Lord, increase our faith, strengthen our hope, keep us safe in your love. Make us always grateful for the gift of life that we share. We ask this through Christ our Lord.